The rain poured down in sheets, turning the narrow, winding road into a slick ribbon of asphalt. Natalie's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white in the dim light of the dashboard. She had been driving for hours, the last remnants of daylight long gone, and her phone's GPS had given up miles back. The road signs were old, worn, barely legible, and she hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The isolation was oppressive, the darkness around her impenetrable. Her eyes flicked to the gas gauge, nearly empty. She cursed under her breath, the needle edging closer to the red. There was no way she could make it much farther. Up ahead, through the curtain of rain, she spotted something, dim lights flickering in the distance. A gas station. Relief washed over her, and she pressed the gas pedal a little harder, the old car groaning as it picked up speed. As she neared the station, the details became clearer. It was small, run down, more like something out of the past. The neon sign buzzed faintly, only one letter still glowing, and the pumps looked ancient, relics from decades ago. She pulled in under the rusting overhang and turned off the engine. The rain pounded against the roof, a constant drumming that set her nerves on edge. Natalie hesitated for a moment, peering out at the station through the fogged-up windshield. There didn't seem to be anyone around. The place looked deserted. Still, she needed gas, and there was no telling when or if she'd find another station. Natalie stepped out into the rain, the cold drops soaking her clothes instantly. She hurried to the pump, frowning as she realized it didn't take credit cards. She'd have to go inside. She glanced at the station's front door. The glass cracked and smeared with grime. The dim light inside flickered intermittently. She jogged toward the door, shivering in the downpour. When she pushed it open, a small bell jingled, though it sounded more like a dull clang. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and oil. Shelves lined with dusty old snacks and faded magazines stretched toward the back, and behind the counter sat an old man, his head bowed, a grimy baseball cap pulled low over his face. "Hey," Natalie called, trying to shake the unease that crept up her spine. "I need to get some gas. How do I?" The man lifted his head slowly, revealing a face so gaunt it seemed almost skeletal. His eyes were sunken, dark hollows in his wrinkled skin. He stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before speaking in a low, gravelly voice. "Cash only." Natalie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. She forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. I've got some cash. How much for a full tank?" The man didn't answer. He just continued to stare at her, and his eyes never blinking. A long, uncomfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the flickering light overhead. "Okay, I'll just grab the pump," she said awkwardly, backing toward the door. As she turned, something caught her eye, a faded missing persons flyer taped to the window near the entrance. She paused, squinting at the photo of a young woman with long, dark hair, her face familiar. Natalie's heart skipped a beat. The woman in the photo looked just like her. Her eyes darted back to the man at the counter, but he hadn't moved. His gaze was still fixed on her, his lips slightly parted as if he were about to speak. Unease turned to fear, her instincts screaming at her to leave. Now. Natalie rushed out of the store and back into the rain. She fumbled with the pump, her hands shaking as she tried to fill the tank. The nozzle felt ancient, heavy in her hands, and the gas trickled out slowly. Too slowly. She glanced back at the station. The old man was still sitting behind the counter, motionless, watching her through the grimy window. The gas pump clicked off, and Natalie shoved the nozzle back into place, her hands trembling. She jumped into her car, locking the doors the moment she was inside. She started the engine, the headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. That's when she saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of her headlights, barely visible in the downpour. It was a woman, standing in the middle of the road, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. Her clothes were torn, soaked, and she stood perfectly still, staring directly at Natalie's car. Natalie's heart hammered in her chest. She threw the car into reverse, her tires spinning on the wet pavement before finally gripping. She backed up, turned the wheel hard, and sped back onto the road, her pulse racing. She glanced in her rearview mirror, but the woman was gone. The road behind her was empty. She drove faster, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The rain blurred the road ahead, but she didn't care. She had to get as far away from that place as possible. As she rounded a bend, her phone buzzed in the cup holder. She snatched it up, grateful that she had service again. There was a new notification, a news alert. She clicked on it with shaky hands, her eyes scanning the headline. Local woman missing after stopping at remote gas station. Her blood ran cold. The photo accompanying the article was the same as the one on the flyer, the woman who looked just like her. The date of her disappearance? Exactly 1 year ago tonight. Her breath caught in her throat. She dropped the phone, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. Panic rose like a tidal wave, drowning out all rational thought. That's when the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered once, then went out, plunging her into darkness. Natalie frantically turned the key, but the car wouldn't start. The rain battered the windshield, the world outside a blur of shadows. Then, through the pounding rain, she saw movement, a figure walking slowly toward her from the side of the road. The same woman, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. She was getting closer. Natalie's heart thudded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She locked the doors, her fingers trembling as she fumbled for her phone. She needed to call for help. She needed to. Tap. A soft knock on the driver's side window. Natalie froze. The woman was standing there, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and lifeless. She smiled, an unnatural, twisted grin that stretched too far across her face. And then with a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "Need a ride?" It was a chilly autumn night, and the road stretched endlessly into the dark countryside. Ryan had been driving for hours, exhausted and eager to reach his destination. His phone's GPS flickered with weak reception, and the last gas station was miles behind him. There were no cars on the road, no signs of life, just the dense forest pressing in on either side. His eyelids were growing heavy, and he knew he couldn't keep driving without a break. That's when he saw her. Standing alone on the side of the road, her figure was faintly illuminated by his headlights. She was wearing a thin white dress that fluttered in the wind, far too light for the cold night air. Her head was down, long dark hair covering most of her face. She wasn't waving for help, wasn't signaling at all, but Ryan felt an odd pull, a strange obligation to stop. Against every ounce of instinct screaming at him to keep driving, he slowed the car to a halt. He rolled down his window just enough to call out to her. "You need a ride?" The woman lifted her head slowly. Her face was pale, eyes hollow and distant, as though she wasn't fully aware of the world around her. She nodded once, without speaking, and walked towards the passenger side. Ryan's heart raced as he unlocked the door. She slid in without a word, her movements almost mechanical. The air in the car grew colder the moment she shut the door. Ryan cleared his throat, trying to shake off the creeping unease. "Where are you headed?" She turned her head towards him, her eyes staring into his with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "Just drive." The atmosphere in the car grew thick with tension. The woman sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, but Ryan couldn't help but glance at her out of the corner of his eye. There was something wrong about her presence, something that made his heart pound harder with every mile they traveled. He tried to focus on the road, but every glance at her made his pulse quicken. The radio suddenly crackled to life, though Ryan hadn't turned it on. Static hissed from the speakers, followed by a faint voice, barely audible over the interference. It sounded like a woman, whispering. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white. He tried to adjust the dial, but the voice only grew louder, repeating a single word over and over. "Run!" Ryan's chest tightened. He turned to the woman beside him, but she hadn't moved. Her head remained bowed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The radio continued its eerie chant, the whisper turning into a distorted scream. He could feel the panic rising, but his body refused to obey the frantic signals from his mind. Suddenly, the woman spoke again, her voice barely above a breath. "He's coming!" Ryan's blood ran cold. "Who?" He stammered, though he already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. The woman turned to him fully now, her face contorting into an expression of pure terror. "He's been following me." Ryan's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The road behind them was empty, but the forest seemed to close in, the trees looming taller, their branches twisting and bending unnaturally. His breath came in shallow gasps. The radio was now blaring, the static deafening, the whispering words lost in a sea of noise. Out of nowhere, the car jolted violently. Ryan barely had time to react before something huge slammed into the rear of the car, sending it skidding across the road. His heart pounded in his ears as he struggled to regain control of the wheel. But the force of the impact was relentless, as though some unseen force was pushing the car off the road. The woman next to him screamed, a gut-wrenching, inhuman sound that made Ryan's skin crawl. He could see her now, thrashing in her seat, her eyes wide with fear, her body convulsing as if she were fighting something unseen. The air grew impossibly cold, frost forming on the windows, the windshield fogging up as if they had plunged into an Arctic winter. "Get out!" she shrieked. "Get out now!" But before Ryan could react, the car flipped. The world spun around him in a blur of darkness and shattered glass. His vision blurred as the car crashed into the ditch, rolling twice before coming to a stop upside down. Everything was silent. Pain throbbed through Ryan's body, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He could hear the woman still, her voice now low and desperate. "Please, he's coming." Through the haze of pain and confusion, Ryan managed to unbuckle his seatbelt and crawl out of the wreckage. The cold night air hit him like a wall. He stumbled to his feet, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run, but he couldn't leave her. He had to help her. He turned back to the car, but she was already gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door wide open. There were no tracks, no sign of her anywhere in the dense woods surrounding them. Panic surged through him. He called out her name, though he didn't even know what it was. His voice echoed into the darkness, unanswered. And then he saw it, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing just beyond the tree line. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, but Ryan could feel its eyes on him, cold and malevolent. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, like something was pressing down on his chest. He could barely breathe. The figure raised one arm, pointing directly at him, and Ryan knew with every fiber of his being that it was coming for him. Without thinking, he turned and ran. His legs felt like lead, the ground beneath him uneven and treacherous, but he didn't stop. He could hear something behind him now, a soft whispering, growing louder with every step he took. It was her voice, but distorted, wrong. The words were twisted, garbled, but the meaning was clear. Run. Ryan didn't look back. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out beneath him, collapsing in the middle of the deserted road. He lay there, gasping for air, his heart racing in his chest. The woods were silent again, the road stretching out in both directions, empty and desolate. He was alone, or so he thought. A car approached in the distance, its headlights cutting through the dark. It slowed as it neared him, the driver rolling down the window. "You need a ride?" the voice called out. Ryan's blood turned to ice. The driver was a woman, her face pale, her eyes hollow, and she was wearing a thin white dress. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead, a barren strip of road cutting through the vast emptiness. Jack had been driving for hours, and the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving nothing but the eerie glow of the moon to light his path. He glanced at the dashboard. Midnight. The clock ticked with a sluggish rhythm, as if time itself was slowing down. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror for what felt like the 100th time. Nothing but darkness behind him, a never-ending void. Yet something felt off, like he wasn't as alone as the road made it seem. He shook the thought from his mind. The solitude was getting to him. The road was desolate. No towns, no rest stops, not even a gas station for miles. His headlights were the only source of light for what seemed like an eternity. Just him, the open road, and the oppressive silence. Then in the distance, something caught his eye. At first, it was just a small dot, but as he neared, he realized it was a figure standing by the side of the road. Their thumbs stuck out. A hitchhiker. Jack felt a wave of unease wash over him. He hadn't seen another soul for miles, and the idea of picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere didn't sit right. But as he drove closer, he could make out more details. It was a young woman, her clothes worn and dirty, her long hair tangled. She looked lost, vulnerable. Jack's mind wavered. He couldn't just leave her out here, could he? Against his better judgment, he slowed down and pulled to the side of the road. The woman walked up to the passenger window, her eyes shadowed and hollow-looking. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. "I need a ride." Something about her tone made Jack shiver, but he unlocked the door and let her in. She climbed into the passenger seat without a word, her movements slow, almost mechanical. As she buckled the seatbelt, Jack tried to force a smile. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked. "Anywhere." Away from here, she whispered. A long silence followed, the weight of it pressing down on Jack like a lead blanket. He glanced over at her, but she was staring straight ahead, her face expressionless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her presence seemed to darken the air around her, like she was sucking the warmth from the car. Jack pressed on the gas, eager to put miles between them and wherever she had come from. The road ahead was empty, nothing but the moonlit desert stretching for miles. The radio buzzed with static, the signal lost in the middle of nowhere, but Jack flicked it on anyway, hoping for some distraction from the unsettling silence. "What were you doing out here?" Jack finally asked, though part of him didn't really want to know. The woman didn't answer for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft it was almost drowned out by the hum of the engine. Running. Running from what? She turned her head slowly toward him, her eyes wide and dark, filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, desperation, or something worse. Him. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Who's him? Before she could answer, a sound broke through the static of the radio, a voice, distorted and distant. Jack leaned forward, squinting at the dashboard. The voice grew louder, clearer, until it formed a single word, repeated over and over. "Stop!" Jack's breath caught in his throat. He glanced at the woman beside him, but she didn't seem to hear the voice. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The voice on the radio grew more insistent, louder, until it was practically screaming. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" Suddenly, the car lurched violently to the side, as if something had hit them. Jack fought to keep control of the wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the road. The radio fell silent. The air was heavy, oppressive, and in the stillness, Jack became aware of a presence outside the car. He didn't dare move, didn't dare look, but the woman turned her head toward the window, her eyes wide with terror. "He's here," she whispered. Jack's pulse raced. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't help himself. Slowly, he turned his head toward the passenger side window. A figure stood there, just beyond the reach of the headlights. Tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadows, its face obscured. It didn't move, but Jack could feel its eyes on him, cold and malevolent. The air inside the car grew colder, freezing, and Jack's breath came in shallow gasps. The woman beside him began to tremble, her voice barely a whisper. "You have to drive. Now." Jack's hands were shaking as he fumbled to start the car again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He tried again, but the ignition clicked uselessly. The figure outside didn't move, but it seemed to be drawing closer, its shadow stretching across the road like a dark stain. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. "If he gets us..." The car suddenly roared to life, and Jack didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as they sped down the highway. He didn't look back, didn't dare check the mirror. The figure was behind them now, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. The woman was shaking beside him, her hands gripping the seat so tightly her knuckles had turned white. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The road stretched on endlessly, the desert swallowing them in darkness. Finally, Jack broke the silence, his voice shaking. "What the hell was that? Who is he?" The woman didn't answer for a moment, her eyes distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. "He's been following me for a long time. No matter where I go, he finds me." Jack's stomach churned. "Why? What does he want?" The woman turned to him, her eyes filled with something beyond fear. Something ancient, primal. "To take me back." Jack didn't ask where back was. He didn't want to know. They drove in silence for what felt like hours. Jack's hands were sweating on the steering wheel, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The woman seemed to sink deeper into her seat, her breathing shallow and uneven. Finally, in the distance, Jack saw something. A faint glow. A town. Relief flooded through him. He wasn't sure how far they had driven, but the sight of civilization made his heart soar. As they approached, the streetlights flickered into view, the small town bathed in the soft, welcoming glow of safety. Jack slowed the car, pulling into the first gas station he saw. The woman didn't move. She sat there, staring ahead, her body stiff. "I can get help here," Jack said, his voice shaky with relief. "We're safe now." But the woman didn't respond. She just stared blankly at the gas station, her face pale and drawn. Jack turned to her, his brow furrowed in concern. "Hey, are you okay?" Her eyes slowly turned to meet his, and Jack's blood ran cold. Her face was different. It was still her, but distorted. Like her features were melting, her eyes too wide, her mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. Her skin had turned ashen, her hands twitching in her lap. "You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered, her voice no longer her own. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing right behind the car.